Welcome back, everyone. I hope you were able to make it through the really long presentation on the first part of A History of the World in 6 classes. This is part 2. I'm going to try and make it a little bit more brief and kind of breeze through coffee, tea, and Coke. So the first part of the book, we deal with alcoholic beverages, things that kind of change the world in terms of classifying the class with the book. The first 3 chapters are really the first semester. The second 3 chapters, this will be kind of our concentration for the second semester. So let's take a look again at the periodization chart. The AP World's periodization looks like this. So we kind of covered in the first part beer, which again, this is kind of the agricultural revolution stage. It goes from 8000 BCE to 600 BCE. And then we get to the wine, which we talked about being classical. And that goes from 600 BCE to about 600 CE, or the Common Era. And then we talked about spirits, which we classify as post-classical. And this is from 600 to about 1450 CE. Now we're getting into a new type of drug, and that's caffeine. And caffeine is a part of all coffee, tea, and Coke. In coffee, this is what we consider to be the early modern period. And the early modern period goes from 1450 to 1750. It's a period that is a boiling point for a lot of historians. It's coming out of the Black Plague in Europe. It's entering into the revolutions that we'll see in the next period, which we classify as the modern period. And the modern period goes from about 1750 to 1900. In terms of periodization, a lot of historians will look at the end of the modern period being 1914, which is the entrance into the First World War. And then that gets us to the last, which is 1900 or 1914, whichever date we decide as a class. And that gets into the contemporary period. And this goes from World War I up to the present day. So that's where we are in terms of periodization. And again, you'll be taking a look at those dates, 1450 all the way to present day, second semester. So where exactly does coffee originate? Where does it come from? There are a lot of different theories. One that is always pretty interesting in terms of origin stories, whether it's true or not, comes from African origin stories. And the African origin story goes like this. Kaldi, who's an Ethiopian goat herd, notices one day that his herd of goats are dancing as they're grazing with cherry red berries that contain coffee beans. So he tries a few of these thinking, well, if the goats are happy, I might as well be happy. And soon he was dancing right alongside his flock. When people witness the goatly gallop, a monk begins to pluck berries for all of his brothers, and that night at night they notice a keen alertness, and they think that alertness is some kind of divine inspiration. So they place some sort of divinity on the cherry red berries and the beans, the coffee beans. History tells us that Africans in general use coffee and animal fat. They're kind of like these primitive power bars in order to gain energy, and then they unwind with wine that's made from the coffee berry pulp. So we see this historically, and this legend again being African origin. It is just a story, so it's hard to say what's true, but this is what kind of originates where the coffee bean was first discovered. Here's a couple questions. Just kind of take a look at some of the questions while I talk briefly about this map. Any one of these questions could be a potential quiz question the first week of school when you get back over the book. Again, you will have a quiz over this book the first week of school along with the maps that you're creating for the summer assignment. Notice the highlighted area. It's a little bit lighter in terms of the brown shade. That's what we call the coffee belt. And in that belt is primarily where coffee is grown. It's not grown anywhere else in the world except in that coffee belt. So you can see where it's grown, the fact that it's really between, along the equator in tropic areas, subtropical areas. The only place in the United States that actually grows coffee is Hawaii, by the way, which is kind of interesting. But America is one of the largest coffee drinking nations in the world. However, Hawaii is the only one that produces coffee as part of the United States. So you can see just by looking at this map how much trade influences coffee being one of those worldwide phenomenons that we see drank all over the world. So again, the bean belt or coffee belt, it's located between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. Again, the tropical areas of the globe, subtropical areas of the globe, and Hawaii is the only state that grows. Now, the rise of Islam contributes greatly to the popularity of coffee. This is an important note. We'll talk a lot about Islam during the classical period, but the rise of Islam really begins around 632 with the death of Muhammad. And with that rise of Islam, if you'll remember from our last video, Muslims, as Muhammad states in the Quran, do not drink alcohol. So by prohibiting the drinking of alcohol, coffee becomes an acceptable drink, something that becomes kind of this social community gathering, and we see that still today. Remember at the beginning of this video, I mentioned all of these drinks will have that effect on the world as a whole, that it becomes kind of a social and communal gathering. So let's talk a little bit about the rise of Islam and the Arabian Peninsula. Coffee becomes the wine of Islam, and it starts on the Arabian Peninsula, where we first historically see the roasting of beans around 1000 AD. Now, that date, again, AD and Common Era, same thing, but again, that date may not be completely historically accurate. It's just really one of the dates that has been thrown around historically for the first brewing of the coffee bean. Sometime around the 15th century, coffee begins spreading throughout the Arab world. Arabs at this time have a unique hold on many of the major trade routes. One of the main trade routes that we'll talk about starting first semester is the Silk Road. And the Silk Road kind of connects Europe with China. And what's unique about that is that the Europeans and Chinese have no contact with each other until really the modern period, when you start to see the British taking a stronghold on China. And we'll talk about that when we discuss tea. Prior to that, there's not a whole lot of contact between China and Europe. That's mostly because of the Silk Roads. You have right in the middle of the Silk Roads the Arabs, and especially the Mongols during the Mongol rule. They control that, and that's what brings in a lot of their funds and money. They're able to keep the Europeans and the Chinese away from each other, and they're able to control the trade between China and Europe. And because of this, that's when we start to see coffee spreading from the Arab world into Europe. And a lot of the coffee, again, comes from places like India, like Africa. It comes from many of those trade routes like the Silk Road, the Saharan Road, some of the ocean trade routes. So we begin to see taking a stronghold in the 15th century. When it becomes popular in the 15th century, it's hailed as kind of this anti-alcohol. It was quite welcome. And this is during the time that we call the Age of Reason, kind of the Enlightenment period. The Age of Reason was a time of scientific discovery. It was a time of procuring new knowledge. It was a time of the Age of the Philosophe, or the Age of Philosophies. One field would influence another. For example, Locke's idea of being born equal, being born with a blank slate, leads to a lot of scientific advances. People enjoy the drinking of coffee because, unlike alcohol, where you have spirits, wine, beer, that kind of makes you spirited, but dulls your senses to a degree because it's a depressant. Coffee and the caffeine found in coffee sharpens the mind, and this is really what leads to a lot of the revolutions, the discussion among different social classes, and we'll talk about that, especially in England in just a moment. But the French Revolution, for example, started in a coffee house, and we'll discuss that as well. It also fuels commerce. It has a lot of links to business, and it remains a fuel of commerce to this day. For example, Lloyd's of London and the London Stock Exchange were both originally coffee houses. Lloyd's of London on Tower Street in 1688 It found a new home in 1691 on Lombard Street, but it was a coffee house for sailors, merchants, brokers, and underwriters. They would get together, they'd drink coffee, they'd talk about shipping, they'd talk about industry, talk about exchange, important news of the day, draw up insurance deals. And this is what we see Lloyd's of London even turning in today. Today, it's not a company, it's a market where a lot of members join together. They insure risks, they talk about kind of the insurance market worldwide as a whole. And again, initially coffee was brewed up in the Islamic world, and it's a safer alternative to alcoholic drinks. It promotes inquiry. It does have medicinal qualities. In fact, there was Sir Francis Bacon who did a lot of experimentation, and a lot of his theory is that human knowledge comes through the classification of the natural world. He actually did a lot of experiments on coffee, and he found through those experiments that using it for medicinal purposes led to cures for what they used to call head melancholy, which is really just a headache, gout, scurvy, smallpox, and this is where we actually get the notion that drinking a cup of coffee helps with extreme drunkenness. It doesn't. The only thing that helps with being drunk is time. You have to let the alcohol come out of your system. But this is kind of where we get that myth, because Sir Francis Bacon came up with the idea that it helps with extreme drunkenness. Women at this time felt threatened by coffee because they argued it has an effect on male potency. What we commonly believe now is that most women probably were upset that their men were spending more time in the coffee house than with them, so that's probably why they had an issue with it or felt threatened by it. You'll notice in the picture down in the far right-hand corner, that is, a painting of Europeans with what looks like a Turk holding a cup of coffee, kind of again showing this classification, the system, different ethnicities, different cultures coming together to discuss ideas around the concept of coffee. An important thing to note is that governments did actually try to suppress these institutions. We especially see this historically during the French Revolution, when you have classes of all kinds, especially females of different classes, taking part in discussing the government, discussing the church, and governments didn't like this, so they attempted to suppress the institutions. Because you have this promotion of freedom of speech, it was some kind of an open atmosphere, different dialogue, different class systems, and the entire empires were built on coffee. I already explained that the Arabs had a monopoly on coffee beans because they controlled, especially the Silk Roads in Africa. They controlled the Saharan trade markets. So they had really a monopoly. The Dutch became middle persons when the Dutch started their age of exploration, and they were able to actually explore all the way around the tip of Africa. They created coffee plantations in Java, for example. That's where we get the nickname for coffee being Java. It comes from that area. It was set up by the Dutch. The French began plantations in the West Indies and in Haiti. With coffee comes sugar, and you know that unfortunately sugar cane is harvested by slaves, and we see that especially in Haiti. What we see with coffee, it has an impact on revolutions, and it has the greatest impact in Haiti, where you have slaves harvesting coffee, the coffee bean, and sugar cane. But we also see that because of something like the French Revolution, it leads to the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution is one of the only successful slave revolts in the history of the world. So it has a negative effect at first, but because of what we see coffee doing in these coffee houses, especially during the French Revolution, it actually leads to something positive for Haiti. Through the study of coffee houses, you can see how it influences the Enlightenment, 19th century revolutions, trade networks, expansion, colonialism, scientific revolution. The Penny University is what was called the English Coffee House. The Penny University was set up where any man, no matter their class, no matter where they stood on the social ladder, could come in, they'd pay 1 penny, they'd get a cup of coffee, and they'd be able to sit and discuss news of the day, talk about deals, talk about politics, talk about anything that they wanted. Actually, the first coffee house in England was set up in, I think, 1694, 93, something like that. And they actually had a post put up on the coffee house. It's kind of a joke now. We see it as kind of satiric, but it stated that you come in, it's a place of freedom of speech. Anyone that's caught swearing would have to forfeit 12 pence. Anyone that starts a quarrel, the instigator would have to buy the offender a cup of coffee. But this kind of becomes satiric because there's no regulation or rules in coffee houses. It really was a place that anyone could come and learn, and that's why they called it the Penny University. I'd like to play a clip for you, and this is a man by the name of Stephen Johnson who kind of discusses the concept of coffee itself, coffee especially during the Enlightenment period, and the impact. So I'm going to play this. It's about a 2.5 minute video, and then we'll come back after the video.
Fora TV, the world is thinking.
So Priestley had this problem where he couldn't get access to, he didn't have the information networks that he needed. And so he got an introduction to Benjamin Franklin and goes to London and meets Franklin in a coffee house, the London Coffee House, and pitches him on this idea for this book about electricity that he wants to write. Now, the coffee house culture is crucial to this story as well, on two levels. First, the information networks of the day. The coffee house was a great hub of Enlightenment era culture. People would come into the coffee house, they would hang out, they would share ideas, they would come from different disciplines. A whole number of crucial events in the history of Enlightenment culture have a coffee house somewhere in them one way or another. The whole insurance business is invented in Lloyd's Coffee House, which becomes Lloyd's of London. And so Franklin had this group called the Club of Honest Whigs that would get together, and they would hang out, and they would talk about electricity, and they would talk about chemistry, and they would talk about politics, and they would talk about religion. And it was really this crucial kind of hub in the information networks of the time. The other important part about the coffee house was the coffee, right? Because until coffee and tea became kind of mainstream beverages in the 18th century, the daytime beverage of choice for both the mass and elites in British society was alcohol, for health reasons, right? Because the water just wasn't safe to drink. And so you had an entire culture that was waking up in the morning and drinking 2 pints of beer, and then, going to work and having a little bit more beer, and then having a little wine, and then having a little gin, particularly in the 1600s, and then having a little more wine, a little more beer. So the entire culture basically was drunk all day long as a kind of default state, right? And so it's not an accident. I mean, it sounds like a joke. It sounds like somebody who drinks a lot of coffee would say, but it's not an accident that the age of reason accompanies the rise of caffeinated beverages. Because think about what your life would be like if you switch from drinking 2 pints of beer in the morning to drinking 2 cups of coffee. I know some of you do drink 2 pints of beer in the morning, and I think I know which ones they are. So you're going to be sharper, you're going to be more productive. The culture is moving from a depressant to a stimulant, and there's going to be results kind of rippling through the culture in that way. So the coffee house is part of the story of why was Priestley able to do what he did at that point.
So with the importance of coffee houses in England, we also see it especially in France. And we talked about this at the beginning of all of this, how it impacts the French Revolution. Coffee houses were a lot more accepting of women. So it wasn't just a culture of different classes of men. In France, it was different classes, period, no matter your gender. And in France, and we'll talk a lot about this second semester when we talk about the French Revolution, you have the three estates. Three estates of France. The first and second estates were the wealthy aristocracy, the clergy, the nobles. The third estate, which was 97 to 98% of everyone else, that was everyone else. That included merchants, it included the commoner, anyone that was considered a commoner, peasants. And this, it leads to 1789, the debt, financial crisis, harsh winters, food shortages. But it really, the famous quote, "To arms, citizens, to arms." This is a young lawyer who cries, sparked the bloody and crazy revolution in France. The thing that you see is that a lot of the discussion of how to take over, what to do, what some of the problems of the day were, how they ended up in debt, the financial crisis, it all started in coffee houses. And the revolution really started as pure discussion at first. Some of the pictures that you see to the right of the writing, we'll talk about This one first. This is the French king. You see the clergy, you see a commoner in shackles. This really represents the concept of the French Revolution, how the commoners were feeling, how 8% of the population was feeling at that time in terms of government taxation, in terms of land ownership, in terms of all the crises that were taking place and food shortages. It just led to a lot of bitterness. This picture that's right next to it, this actually shows an image in this painting of the fish women. And fish women we'll talk about a little bit during the revolution in an interesting group who cut fish and put them into boxes. They rose up and ended up storming the castle. The painting underneath it is a painting by David, and it's called The Tennis Court Oath. And again, a lot of popular images from the Revolution just showing the anger and bitterness of the commoners in general. The last thing that we're going to end with today, and because this video ran a little long, I'm going to split this up into 3 different videos, 2 or 3 different videos. So check back for the video on tea a little bit later in the week. But the last video that we'll end with before I say goodbye is a video called Coffee, the Greatest Addiction in the World. Kind of an interesting, fun video to watch. It's, a bit harsh, I guess, in different ways. But let's take a look at coffee, the greatest addiction ever.
Every day, the world consumes 300 tons of caffeine, enough for 1 cup of coffee for every man, woman, and child. The world's largest buyer of coffee, the US, has to import nearly all of this, as the coffee trees from which caffeine is harvested will only grow at commercial levels between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn in an area called the Coffee Belt. Only a single state, Hawaii, is within this belt. However, the United States is only the largest buyer because it's so populous. The most enthusiastic coffee drinkers per capita are, in increasing order, the Netherlands, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and, the world champions, Finland, where they drink 3 times as much coffee a day as the average American. All of these countries are outside the coffee belt and must import 100% of their caffeine supply. To get this caffeine, first bees must pollinate the flowers of a coffee tree, and these flowers develop into bright red berries. Unlike more cooperative domestic plants, the coffee tree does not ripen all its berries at the same time, so they need to be hand-picked and sorted. Once picked, the coffee bean is removed from inside the berry. This young seedling of the tree is then dried, heated, ground, and submerged in boiling water to get out the precious caffeine. It takes about 40 coffee beans to make 1 shot of espresso. But why is caffeine in the coffee beans in the first place? It's not like the coffee trees want to have humans cutting bits off of them and committing a holocaust of their offspring. Well, the trees, of course, don't want or feel anything. They originally evolved caffeine for their own benefit. Caffeine is an insecticide that effectively paralyzes or kills bugs chomping on the tree. Whether or not these insects go out experiencing the greatest caffeine high ever is not known. While caffeine is technically lethal, it's adapted for 1-gram bugs, not monkeys 100,000 times more massive, so you'd really have to try to win this Darwin Award. But, if you must, to calculate the dose of caffeine you'll need to ingest to have a 50% chance of death, take your mass in kilograms and multiply it by 150 milligrams. Or, in terms of coffee, for every kilogram of mass you have, you need to drink 1 latte to get a visit from the Grim Reaper. That's a lot of coffee, so it's not surprising that there are no recorded deaths in healthy adults from this method, and it's doubtful that it's even possible, because while you're busy getting coffee in, your body is busy getting it out by one way or another. The rare recorded deaths from caffeine are from diet pills, pet pills, and crazy people who eat the drug in its pure form. Poison though caffeine is, you do still develop an addiction to this stuff, and it's a real physiological addiction, not a wimpy psychological addiction like people claim for video games and the internet. But caffeine isn't heroin, rapid withdrawal won't kill you. It might make you cranky and give you a wicked headache, but since caffeine releases dopamine to make you happy and it gets rid of headaches, there's really no reason to ever stop using this stuff. And who would want to give it up anyway? I mean, aside from converts to Mormonism and Rastafarianism. Caffeine is the world's most used psychoactive drug, and with good reason. It's pure awesome. It increases concentration, decreases fatigue, and gives you better memory. And this isn't just a placebo, these are real effects replicable in a laboratory. And, contrary to popular belief, drinking coffee isn't a Faustian bargain where the devil gives you the ability to work faster, but in exchange makes your life shorter. For normal, healthy humans, there are no medical concerns. Coffee and the caffeine within it may even have medical benefits, such as protection from cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and Parkinson's. Caffeine can even get rid of migraines, but the amount required and the method of ingestion is uncomfortable. Moving right along. You know what else you can thank caffeine for? A little thing called the Enlightenment. In the 1600s, people drank more beer and gin than water. But with the introduction of coffee and tea, people switched from a depressant to a stimulant. It's not surprising then that this time was an intellectual boon compared to earlier centuries. Ben Franklin and Edward Lloyd loved their coffee for the same reason that modern workers and students do. It's invaluable for staying awake and concentrating when you need to finish a TPS report or get through that boring physics class. Coffee is the fuel of the modern world, so go grab a cup guilt-free and get working smarter and faster.
Okay, so kind of an interesting video. It says obviously sale for coffee to drink coffee. Again, caffeine, it is a stimulant, it is a drug, it is addictive. In fact, just to say that there were a lot of opponents to the drinking of coffee, especially in England when it was on its rise. They believed that coffee caused nerve disorders, trembling limbs, that they could cause potential death, heart problems. All of these things are true to a degree. I mean, you think you drink 7 cups of coffee in the morning, you're going to be trembling a little bit. So they believed there were a lot of opponents to coffee thinking that it was worse for you than alcohol at the time. So it's not to say that during the Enlightenment everybody was in favor of drinking coffee, but it still became extremely popular. It's interesting to note too, at the same time, in many of the British coffee houses especially, you had tea being served and you had chocolate being served as well. Two delicacies, and we'll talk about tea in much more detail next time. Until then, thanks for watching, and I hope you're enjoying the rest of your summer and the rest of History of the World in 6 classes. See you soon.